Welcome to the Lived Experience Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Tamia Ryan, and today we're diving into a topic that's close to many individuals, and that's expectant mothers and the role of doulas in pregnancy and childbirth. So I'm excited to introduce Miss Bianca Sprague. She is a dedicated doula and the founder of Bebo Mia Incorporated. And her work focuses on supporting pregnant individuals who would otherwise face pregnancy, labor, and postpartum period alone. Her organization collaborates with various social agencies to provide volunteer doula care to parents and families in need. So thank you so much, Bianca, for joining me today. I'm excited to get into this topic. It is so important, especially with all that is going on today regarding women's reproductive health. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. Anytime I get a platform to talk about this, I'm here for it.
Yes. And let's just get right into it and talk about how did you start on this journey into becoming a doula and what inspired you to pursue this path?
Yeah, I was thrust into it quite anyway. It was the birth of my daughter that she'll be 17 this year, well actually in 48 hours. And I I was so transformed from that moment that I had things that I felt so powerful, but I literally felt like any place I felt powerful throughout my birth journey, that the system was like so actively disempowering me. And then the places where I already felt either disenfranchised or that I was struggling or insecurities like not having social support, domestic violence, being under resourced. Those were things that I already was really struggling and had insecurities around. And I found that they got even worse. And so I remember pacing with Gray, that's my daughter. And I was just like pacing my kitchen, bouncing, being like, what am I going to do? I couldn't believe what I just went through. I felt so incredible. And at the same time, had never felt worse and more angry. And so I literally felt like my skin didn't fit. And so I kept thinking, well, if I had these problems, I can't be alone in this. Like there has to be other people. And so my plan was actually to be an obstetrician. And so I'd done all my pre-med and I was like, that was my goal. And then I realized how much harm came at the hands of my doctor through my pregnancy and my birth experience and my postpartum experience. And so I wasn't really sure what I was going to do because I only knew really doctor midwife. And then I found discovered doula care. And so I did my doula training, which was, I mean, it was fine. Like, thank God I did my pre-med because I felt really confident with all of the science part of it, but the weekend training just like was not good enough. So my first problem, I was like, great, I need to go build community for parents who are struggling. I had an undiagnosed postpartum mood disorder because I just didn't even have any care for anybody to even notice for 2 years that I'd been struggling with postpartum depression. And so my problem one was making sure parents feel safe, seen, and celebrated through their reproductive journey. And then problem two was we need better trainings for doulas. So I was building essentially two businesses simultaneously, and my doula training actually took off. And so we were brick and mortar in Toronto, and then we moved exclusively online 11 years ago. So we had it like down pat by the time the pandemic hit because our business was all online. And so now we train doulas and any folks that want to work with infertility, loss, birth, and postpartum period. And we have students in 49 countries. And when I take a step back and I look at this social justice, reproductive justice movement that I built, I cannot believe that this was a 26-year-old kid pacing a kitchen with $0 in her bank account and domestic violence. And so it's absolutely unbelievable. And there's not a day that goes by that I'm not just like oozing gratitude for finding this calling and really trusting my gut and marching along. It's been hard, but it's been pretty magical.
Wow. Well, first off, thank you for sharing all of that. I mean, that is amazing to think about 49 countries, right? And the impact that you're making. That is just amazing. Can you walk us through a little bit about the differences? Because you mentioned OBGYN, midwife, doula. What are some of the differences so people just have the proper understanding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we look at healthcare providers, so folks that would follow somebody through their reproductive journey and responsible for their healthcare, we have three options, again, depending what country you're in, but three options. And that would be your GP, so your family doctor, if they have an obstetric specialty, which it used to be pretty common practice because your local doctor would be who catch your babies. But that has shifted. So not all family doctors will do care into your pregnancy, but that's option one. Then there is the option of a midwife, which again, depending on your country or your area, there is a lot of issues around access. And there's also been a lot of policies that have stopped traditional and indigenous midwifery practices and these groups are actively fighting the court systems to ensure that they have their rights back to serve their indigenous communities. So there's traditional midwifery as well as regulated, which some people for slang call the midwives. So midwifery options. And then you also have the option of an OB-GYN. Now, as soon as obstetrics became a surgical specialty, you'll find when you're through that path that you're going to have a higher intervention. There's going to be there's going to be statistically more testing and statistically worse outcomes. So I just want to put that out because people always think that the OB-GYN is going to be like the best, but OB-GYNs, they're really there for crisis situations. And they don't really know what to do with, for all intents and purposes, normal, boring, regular pregnancies. And so you'll find that you could potentially have a normal, boring pregnancy, which is what we want. But you'll suddenly find yourself leaning towards the high risk or leaning towards all this, extra. So that's the care team. Now a doula comes in to really act like the go-between between the family, the birthing person, and the healthcare team. And the great thing about a doula is that we are not there to sway you in any one way. So sometimes people believe we're trying to make you have a natural birth or a pelvic birth or birth at home or a water birth. A good doula should be there to just make sure that you always feel like you're choosing what's happening in your labor and your postpartum period, because a lot of times people describe their births that it happened to them, that they were like, oh, suddenly I was just in the bed and suddenly I had an IV and then they took off my underwear and then they put their hand inside my vagina. And like all of these things, A, require consent, which the hospitals do not do in reproductive health. And B, they require you to have information about the risks and the benefits and the alternatives for all of those things. So I really slow down that process. And unfortunately, the outcome, especially when we look at the US, it's leading with the worst outcomes of all of the wealthy countries, the colonizing countries. And the outcomes have never been worse in modern history. And that's just the bar has never been worse. And then when we go and look at any marginalized communities like Black and Brown women, for example, women living in bigger or fat bodies, trans birthers, queer birthers, we're seeing a death of both the birther and the baby at 3 to 20 times what it would be for a white person. And so doulas, we should be going in there to really like have an empowered magical birth, but our job is now extended to essentially be life-saving for families. So, my goal is for people to feel joy, but I first have to make sure that they are safe and alive and well, because of the state of what's happening with both oppression within the system and the fact that we're overusing these medical tools that were supposed to only be used in emergency situations. And so doulas are, we really make sure that people feel physically supported, emotionally supported, and informationally supported. And it's such a game changer. Like, honestly, y'all, if you're expecting, please don't go into your hospital without a doula. And they're covered now by insurance. So Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE for the military families, like people are recognizing what a difference it makes. And so please go find yourself a doula. Their doulas are for everybody. You just have to find the doula that, you really vibe with.
Thank you for that. And, I was thinking as you were talking about consent, I can remember with my second son, like I was just getting shoved papers and I'm like, what is this? Like, I didn't have to sign this like with my first son. Like, what are you, everything was like happening so fast. And I'm like, well, what are these papers? It was like a clipboard with like 5 pages. Yeah. I'm like, well, what is this? And it was just such like, I felt like a rushed feeling, even though I had been through it before. Right. But it speaks to that need of advocacy, right? Especially when you are afraid, or it's your first time, or even if it's your fifth time, right? Because as we know, like every birth can be different, and just
Hmm.
like having that support is so important. Can you
Yeah.
speak a little bit? And you talked about this, about how the role of doulas has evolved over the years. What are some of the ways that you feel doulas really positively impact maternal and infant health outcomes?
Oh, I love that question. It gave me goosebumps, gave me in all the feels. So when I was a baby doula almost 20 years ago, it was really perceived that it was really focusing on natural birth, and it was predominantly white families. Like, it was more common
Mhm.
knowledge among the white community. Now, I also lived in an urban setting, and so doulas were slightly more common. So like New York City has always been really familiar with doulas. I lived in Toronto, which is
Mhm.
like Canada's New York City, which is a fraction of the size, but it was like more common. To see now that doulas are in demand in rural communities is really exciting for us, because it shows
Yeah.
that people are understanding the role of a doula, and that they are for all folks. And because of this, we're seeing a huge increase in doulas getting trained, and so doulas are able to serve self-segregated communities, which is really it's really important to have somebody that has that lived experience or that understanding of
Mhm.
the clients that they're serving. So like, at the time, there was, I don't even know, I don't think there might have been one or two BIPOC doulas in Toronto. And so like, I know I can
Mhm.
do really great things for my Black clients. And
Right.
I have as close as understanding as I can, as I'm like unlearning white supremacy and all of these terrible things that we've been infected by. And like, my daughter is mixed
Right.
race, so like, I have a very close proximity experience of the Black experience,
Mhm.
but I don't have that lived experience. And so to
Right.
see in my community, the majority of my students are BIPOC, which is so exciting to know that all of these
Yeah.
Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks are going to have somebody from within their community that already has cultural
Mhm.
competence, that already might have a shared language if English is not, their first or second or third language, can
Right.
understand like religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, practices, like these things. And so to know that folks that otherwise would be not only just fighting for their rights, but now have somebody that can like effortlessly keep them in that ease because they have that shared
Mhm.
experience. Like, we have, oh my God, I get so excited. We have such a great movement for deaf and hard of hearing doulas now. So they're getting
Mhm.
trained to be medical translators as well as providing that care. And so I've had at least 10 doulas that I know that do all of their care in sign. And so to know like that just didn't exist for folks before. So now they're getting to go in
Right.
and have somebody signing and doing that care. And so like, that's just a small example, but that's happening all over the place, which is, I mean, it would just change how somebody's birthing. So folks living with visible and invisible disabilities, but mostly
Right.
across the board for all folks that are having their babies, they're feeling empowered in that. And that's one of the
Mhm.
biggest differences that doulas make, because when you are leaving feeling trauma, big T or little t trauma, you're already behind on feeling like you're a competent and confident parent. And so when you felt
Right.
like when we're leaving our births with a state of either violation that we can explicitly name, or just this feeling of like, I didn't consent, but I don't have the language to know what happened. And then you go out
Mhm.
with your newborn and everybody focuses on the gratitude. Your baby's here. You should just be happy your baby's here. And
Right.
parents slide backwards because not only are they feeling like they're getting the support and healing that they need, that all parents need, let alone when we have a trauma coursing through our bodies, but we also don't
Mhm.
have folks that are giving them the space to say, I'm grateful my baby's here, and I feel violated,
Right.
and I feel disappointed about my birth, and I wish I didn't do that, and I'm angry,
Mhm.
I'm sad, I feel depressed and I don't know why. And so doulas, like, we're we are stopping that cycle, and so that people are leaving, and they do have to go through the healing, because birth is a major transition. It's a transition for our mind, body, our soul. But we don't have as that big of a gap where we're now also dealing with trauma and obstetric violence and those sorts of things, because doulas are really keeping that space safe.
And I love what you're doing, because, you know, the part that I think sometimes people miss is like, after an individual has a child, it's like when you're pregnant, everyone is like, oh my goodness, you know, they're doting over you, right? But for some, like after that pregnancy, and some that's not their experience. Let me also be clear and say that. But for many, it's like when you're pregnant, it's like, okay, everybody is just giving you all that attention. But after the baby,
they're gone. Born, it's crickets.
That's when it's like, hey, like you said, you're happy, everything's good, see ya, you know. And that's when a lot of individuals then start to fall into that depression, because now it's like, okay, what's next, you know? And so having that support that you talked about, I think is really vital in helping them have that education of what they're experiencing. This is normal. Many individuals experience this. Let's normalize this, and so that you're not isolated and afraid.
Yeah. We know catching anxiety and depression in the postpartum period, the earlier we catch it, the easier it is to treat, as you know, expert in these things.
Yes.
And so when we have a doula in that space, not only do we follow our clients, so if we're just doing birth work, we do follow them into the postpartum period, but we also have postpartum doulas that are able to catch any of these mood disorders, whether it's psychosis, depression, anxiety, ambivalence, and we're able to get that care faster, so that they're not having this kind of prolonged suffering experience. And I think that is like such a valuable tool, especially knowing that the rate of people leaving with PTSD, so postpartum PTSD, it just keeps going up. And so we know that needs care, because it's just going to be a domino effect. And so doulas in your home in those early weeks are really great, but also you're able to check in with your doula later, because a lot of times people think if they don't have it in the first few weeks, they're in the clear, like they've made it through the baby blues, they feel all right. But you know, postpartum mood disorders can come anytime in the first two. I actually extend it to 2 to 3 years, because sometimes we are like having maybe secondary infertility, or like, you know, there's lots of things that happen with that natural spacing time that people start thinking about other babies, or like having very mixed feelings about the pressure to have more children. And so, you know, you can still check in. Like I have clients that check in with me for years, and just, you know, and doulas will reach out and say like, how are you? And we know the questions to ask. So it's not just like, hey, how are you? And people say, fine. And then we move on. Like, we know, how are you sleeping? How is your heart? How's your mood? You know, are you having any intrusive thoughts? Are you finding, like, especially the signs of anxiety? You know, are you avoiding staircases? Are you avoiding driving with your baby? Have you been avoiding having other people hold your baby? These are really important questions that we can get a lot of information, and not even our doctors at our postpartum visits are asking that. And our friends don't know to ask that. And those are the things we need to know. So if people are having intrusive thoughts, or now they've just avoided stairs altogether, I use that example because it's very common that the people have this image that they fall down the stairs and then they just stop going the stairs with their baby, and then they become more and more and more isolated. And these are all products of how we feel when we've birthed and how supported we feel in the postpartum period. And so, you know, all the things we're discussing, doulas are the antidote, and they're, you know, we're really filling those gaps of where our systems are failing us, that the systems that we're supposed to be trusting. And there's a lot of holes in those systems.
Well, and I'm just, you know, my mind is just going, because as you were like going through some of those questions that I know I've never been asked by by a provider, you know, after having a child. And I started thinking like, wow, like there are so many missing gaps. And, you know, of course you get the standard, are you feeling down? Are you feeling sad or blue? Which people don't want to really answer that, because they feel like they're supposed to feel happy. They don't want to say that they feel sad, right? They just had a baby. So they're supposed to be great. So like really diving into those questions and asking those open questions.
Yeah.
Go back to
and people are scared too. people are
Yeah.
scared to answer those questions. You don't know what's going to happen if you say no. If there's
Yep.
apprehension, is it going to go in your record? A
Right.
lot of times family courts are involved, and are they going to use this to
Yes.
weaponize that you're not a good parent? So these
Yes.
are to have somebody that you feel safe, that is not like there's a gray area around our duty to report for doulas. We have a
Hmm.
little bit more leeway. So these are all, yeah, very different experience.
I was going to ask about that. It's like you read my mind because you were talking about, individuals' experience in the marginalized communities and the mistrust that's there with the modern healthcare system. How do you work around that, especially working with Black, Brown people who have had these negative experiences, have had negative outcomes in the past? How do you help establish that rapport and trust?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And in our programs, we actually talk a lot about this. And this is one of my favorite things, that when I look in my classroom, that the majority of my students represent marginalized communities, because there's only so far that I know with my white skin. And if anybody isn't
Hmm.
seeing this, if you're just listening, I'm white. So there's only so much that I could be like, you could trust me, but I know that my whiteness inherently, like, I wouldn't trust a white person if I was BIPOC, like,
Right.
period, just because why would you? And so
Hmm.
what we get to talk about in our courses is the policing of parents and how much of it is rooted in white supremacy. So what is a good parent? And to me,
Hmm.
like, for example, when we have our students who are like, they come with cases like, my client is a sex worker, and she's found, like, how she's managing is she puts her kid in the back seat when she goes. And, like, to me, I'd hear that story and I'd think, wow, that's a really good mom. She's like making it work. And all I hear is how much systems are failing her, that she's got a baby in
Hmm.
the back and this is how she has to be paying the bills. Like, there's a lot of things, but I know that most
Right.
people that you would say outside of my community would have so much judgment of this mom and would think that
Right.
these are signs of a terrible mom, and completely
Mhm.
miss the zooming out of, like, where is the other parent? Where are social
Exactly.
programs? Why does she even have to be working in her first 6 weeks? Like, all of these
Mhm.
things. And so in my program, we really unpack who decided what a good parent is, and, like, where is the threshold. And so I love, for example, in Canada, we have quite a significant Indigenous community within Bebo Mia. And so to have just them taking over and saying, we're actually going to be using an Indigenous scale, and Indigenous
Mhm.
interventions, so that we can continue to support the family getting well, whether we're looking at addiction issues. And instead of
Right.
shaming a parent for returning to active use, instead stepping back and looking at, how did it feel to return to your coping tool that you used before? Does it still
Mhm.
help? Do you still feel good? Is it working the way you wanted? And then allowing them to actually step and say, like, actually, getting high didn't work for me. I don't feel the same as when I
Right.
was, 5 years before I had a baby. I have been clean for this amount of time, and seeing it instead as a sign that she needs more support or they need more support, and not
Mhm.
going to the shame, not going to the reporting and, like, apprehension and all of these things, and let somebody land at, that tool didn't work. What else do I have to add to my toolkit? And so these are the
Mhm.
conversations that we have when we're talking about working with families, because what I would, how I was raised or my lived experience might be very different. Well, I can guarantee it's very different than a doula who's
Mhm.
working exclusively with the West Indian community. And so if
Right.
you send in somebody from outside community, they would be policing and would see things that they would potentially see as a duty to report. Which is
Right.
why I'm great, because someone else would be like, no, this is normal. And this is normal, not in the way like
Mhm.
everybody does this, but like, this is not
Right.
harmful. This is community parenting. This is the way my community
Mhm.
is choosing to handle this. And I've decided that nobody's at risk here. And with some education or more support, we can work this
Right.
out as a community. And so I think
Yes.
when, back to your earlier question about how is, like, what are some of these, great things that are coming, and that's truly like a harm reduction model, that's truly trauma
Right.
informed care. And you can't have that, though, if we're having a room full of just white people having these conversations and making these decisions. And so when we do see folks from the Latinx community, because I have a huge Latinx community, they go out and they're like, I've been able to come in with updating some of these should be outdated, kind of outdated parenting things that grandparents might be
Right.
saying, to be like, maybe we
Mhm.
shouldn't hit or call them a fast girl. And instead, let's try this language, but they can do it in a way that feels like they can, bring in some of the attachment science, not
Mm-hmm.
attachment parenting, but attachment science. And like say, hey, so research now shows when we let babies cry, it actually doesn't teach them independence. It's a stress response, but they can be delivering it in a way that is
Mm-hmm.
connecting in their community versus historically it was white folks coming in and being like, you just let your baby cry. And then this kind of like
Right.
shame, and you're not going to get anywhere
Mm-hmm.
with that. Right. And so that's
Exactly.
one of the ways that I think it's so important that people from communities can bring in, evidence-based information that isn't riddled in shame. There's no judgment in it. And it's just to
Mm-hmm.
be like, hey, let's talk about this. Did you know there's some other ways? How did you feel when your parents did this when you were younger? Did it
Right.
elicit shame? Do you feel resentment? Let's break this cycle and
Mm-hmm.
here's some ideas. Um,
Yes.
and so that makes, that's how I say there's a gray area of the duty to report. And obviously we, as all of my students, we also learn when we need to report, like what are the things when we have
Mm-hmm.
domestic violence, and if the birther and the baby are being harmed at home, like those are things that we might need to get some extra support in there, obviously. But
Right.
there's a lot that we can like really come in and like damper areas that could be really fiery and could potentially lead to more harm. And instead we can have healing and connection and really great progress for parents and how they're choosing to parent this generation.
And there's two things that are just going off in my head. One, when you talked about judgment and shame, because I think when you become a parent, if you've never experienced judgment, the judgment, if you were never in tune with it, like you are
It
definitely
drips.
sensitive to it, right? You're like, oh, am I doing this right? Am I doing it how they're doing it? And it's like the level of judgment that you might feel, whether it's real or not. That's how we perceive it. So I
Yeah, it's
love,
real most of the time.
yeah, it's real. And I also appreciate what you talked about inclusivity, because those of you watching and listening, this is what inclusivity looks like. We hear it and we say it, it's a buzzword, but this is what it really
Hmm.
looks like, what it represents. You have allies, when you have people being brought in to collaborate, that is what inclusivity looks like. So that's what you're doing, and that just warms my heart, because it's something that we hear people say, but we don't really see what it means. We don't apply it
Yeah.
practically, and so you're just a
Well, thank you for
wonderful
saying that.
representation of that. Yes.
That
Can you
means a
talk a
lot.
bit? Yes, it's real. I mean, just hearing you talk about what you're doing, how you're bridging the gaps in the communities, and also how you tailor your approach. Because when you look at modern healthcare, that's not the case. Everything is standardized. We follow the
Hmm.
script, right? Because that's how we maintain consistency. And consistency is important, but you have to have those opportunities to allow people to be unique and to embrace their differences, right? So I
Yeah.
love that, that's what you're doing in your practice and your approach. Can you talk a little bit about the future of doula care? Where do you see it going? Where did it start and where is it going?
Well, I think what I would say would be pretty unpopular. I think my other folks that train doulas, yeah, I'm gonna say I think you'll like what I'm gonna say, but
Yes.
um, I I mean, when we look at the market trends, we know doulas are expected to. I think right now they're sitting at um to to expand tenfold, which is really great. I think that the access is wonderful because insurance providers, like Medicaid, Medicare, TRICARE in the US, are covering doulas. So we will see more of that. But unfortunately, I've already seen, which I'm very excited that the insurance is covering, but with that, the regulation is starting to roll out. And I'm very anti regulation for doulas because regulation is always upholding the worst parts of white supremacy. And it
Mm.
will literally take away the magic of what we do, which is what happened to midwives. Is we had all these really
Mm-hmm.
beautiful traditional midwives. And in Canada, the biggest midwifery movement was brought in by the Caribbean community, and then as
Mm-hmm.
the Caribbean and Indigenous our indigenous peoples. And so by having that regulation, white folks took over. They wouldn't license traditional midwives. And then we had to do all this charting and reporting, and we saw the interventions rise and the outcomes go down. And so I am really nervous about that happening with doula care. And there are a lot of doulas. They're mostly white owned organizations that are really gunning for regulation because you do make more money, and it would mean everybody starts making more money. But the doulas would then have their hands tied, and we'd have, the same thing that happens with any helping and healing field that was traditionally feminist. Once men see they can profit from it, we lose the magic. It becomes a business only, which is what happened to our healthcare. Our healthcare used to be way better. We did better when we had just herbs at our fingertips because people were healers, and now they're no longer, they keep us sick. And they're, how many people are complaining about their healthcare experience that they still don't have a diagnosis and they've had lots of surgeries and they're still in pain. Like, it's not conducive to it. So I'm really scared for doulas that that's what's going to happen. And it is looking that way. And there are a few states already that we're actually in disputes with, we being doulas, and doula trainers, because nurses have already seen how they could benefit within it. And so they're trying to take over and standardize the training for doulas in those states. And that feels really, it makes me, Ohio is leading the charge on that. And it makes me really nervous, because I would way rather that they had a standardization for doula training organizations, which is something I've been gunning for, because I think that is great, because I think everyone should show that they're doing anti-racist work. I think they should show they're doing body liberation work, that they understand trauma-informed care. Like, I think the trainings need to be way better, and I would love to be the bar for that, because I think we are. But now I'm seeing that not only are, like, they're stripping it right back, and which would essentially get it very close that it just starts folding into healthcare providers and insurance. They're actually taking over and doing what we're doing, and like kind of distributing for underpaid. There'd be essentially underpaid jobs, like what they did with personal support workers. So that makes me a little bit nervous, but right now I feel like I'm at the peak hopeful that we are getting coverage from insurance, but we still get to do what we want to do. But we do know that the trend is more people want to be doulas. More people are hiring doulas. There's a bit of a doula shortage right now. So if anybody is interested in becoming a doula, please check out my website. We have scholarship programs for women and queer folks. We just need more doulas trained. So if you are no or low income, we will cover your doula training just so that you can get out there and be serving within your communities. I know that was a bit of a shameless plug, but it segued real nice.
No, we're like in tune. We're like connected. Because my next question was, so talk about your organization. Where can people look you up? And we'll have all this information down in the podcast description too. But where can people find you?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you like hanging out on social media, you can always check us out on Facebook and Instagram. Our handles everywhere are Bebo Mia Inc. That's BEBOMIAINC. But if you are interested in our doula training, we do offer one. It's a full spectrum training. It's called our Maternal Support Practitioner training. If you've been curious about being a doula and you're shopping around, I just want to share some highlights. Please make sure you understand the fee structure for your organization you're exploring, because sometimes people will have a really low cost doula training, but they'll have annual fees that can be anywhere from $500 to $800, and you lose your certification if you don't pay them. And so one of the things is our organization has no hidden fees. You pay your tuition once, and we will handle your continuing education. We'll take care of you. We actually have free therapy for all of our students and alumni, because I believe that you have to have healed healers. We are the only doula training organization that you get to work with a therapist, because this can bring up a lot of stuff. It can bring up our own birth experiences. When we learn about, trauma-informed care, we can realize how we didn't receive that. You might have been harmed at the hands of your doctor, domestic violence survivor, any of these things that are really important that you have care around that. And then when we go out and work with our clients, we can see things that can be, upsetting all the way to we would describe as traumatic. And so we do want to make sure that you are always well. So that therapy is included, and you have it forever as long as you want to hang out with us in Bebo Mia. You get access to that. And we also, our program is a full spectrum program. So at the end of it, you are certified to work within fertility, pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. It doesn't mean you have to work in all of those, but we believe
Mhm.
that full understanding of the whole life cycle of reproductive health is really important, because if somebody has a long trying to conceive journey, the likelihood that they're going to have postpartum depression is significant, and we want you to understand
Mhm.
that, to know really what did they go through to have IVF. What does it look like when you've had multiple miscarriages, to really understand that, so that you can take really good care of them in the postpartum period, if that's the area you're most drawn to.
Thank you for sharing that. And as I mentioned, we'll have all your information down in the description so people can look you up and find you. How can we support doulas? Because I'm hearing you say, they're trying to make some changes. What are some ways that people can get involved and just support the cause?
Oh, that's a great question. If you did have a doula, really, if you check what's happening in your state, and if there's any regulation barriers, or if there's something like, especially Ohio, for example, the parents that are reaching out saying, I had a doula and like I loved it, and protect doulas. Those are always really great ways. You can also donate. There's multiple causes. So we accept donations for our scholarship program, and to support families who are no and low income. But there's lots of ways you can donate so that people do have access to doula care. So the Global Doula Project is another one. It's an organization we do a lot of projects with. So they're global like we are, and they can support people in any country. Um, and then, really talking about doulas. If you had a great experience, post about it so that more people
Mhm.
know that you had a doula and like what made them great. It's also really awesome to find out if you can leave a testimonial or a review for your doula. They're really hard for small businesses to get those testimonials and
Yeah.
reviews. And so I know it's one of the things. I teach a course about testimonials and reviews, and people are like, it's so hard. Nobody wants to write, even though they text me saying how great I am, but they won't just like
Mhm.
go to Google. So please go review your small businesses, and so that it really helps us grow and get the name out, and people look at testimonials and reviews, and so it's also really helpful. So there's lots of ways that you can do that. Those are just a few.
Well, thank you so much. I have learned so much. I mean, my mind is just going, and I just appreciate you for one, providing that education, breaking down the myths that exist, but just again, your inclusivity, the spirit that you have in supporting communities, especially those Black and Brown communities, marginalized communities, and just offering that additional support. So, thank you for everything that you're doing. I hope to definitely have you back and hear about I know you're going to be coming up with more new things, and hearing about your advocacy and all the great work that you're doing. So thank you again so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really great.